Charles de Gaulle, the general who refused to surrender the seeds of destiny. Silence hung over the city of Lille on November 22, 1890. In a modest townhouse on Rue Princesse, as frost traced patterns on the windows, a boy was born into a world that had not yet healed from its wounds. His name was Charles-André Joseph Marie de Gaulle, and from his first breath he inherited a country's pain. His father, Henri de Gaulle, was not a man who forgot. A teacher of philosophy and literature, Henri had fought in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, and the memory of that humiliation burned in him like a coal that never cooled. France had been crushed, Alsace and Lorraine torn away, the national pride trampled beneath Prussian boots. Every night at the dinner table, Henri spoke not of glory but of duty, not of victory but of restoration. He told his 5 children that they were born to serve France, to erase the stain of defeat. Young Charles listened. While other boys played, he read. While others dreamed of simple lives, he constructed elaborate military campaigns in his imagination. His grandmother wrote poems about faith and sacrifice. His uncle, also named Charles de Gaulle, was a passionate Celtic historian who believed in the union of oppressed peoples. The family library overflowed with volumes on French history, ancient battles, philosophies of power. By the time Charles was 10, he had read Plato and Nietzsche, Bergson and Chateaubriand. He had studied the campaigns of Napoleon. He had memorized the defeats and victories that shaped France. When Charles was 11, the family moved to Paris. There, at the Collège Stanislas, he stood out not for athletic prowess, but for his height and his seriousness. They called him the Grand Constable and the Big Asparagus, because even as a teenager he towered over his classmates. But there was something else about him, something his instructors noticed with a mixture of admiration and unease. The boy possessed an unwavering conviction in his own destiny. He seemed to carry himself as though he already knew the great things he would accomplish. In July 1906, at 16, Charles made his decision. He would become a soldier, not for adventure or glory, though he did not disdain those things. He would become a soldier because France needed warriors, and he believed with absolute certainty that he was meant to be one of them. His family had produced historians and writers, but Charles would be the one to make history. He entered the military academy at Saint-Cyr in October 1909. After a year of service in the ranks as required by law, he served first as a private, then corporal, then sergeant in the 33rd Infantry Regiment. His company commander observed him with skepticism. The young man clearly believed nothing less than Constable of France would be good enough for him, but there was no denying his capabilities. When Charles finally entered Saint-Cyr, he threw himself into his studies with fierce determination. He graduated in October 1912, ranking 13th out of 210 cadets. His instructors noted his gifts, intelligence, dedication, natural authority. They also noted something more troubling. He was harsh toward the opinions of others. He carried himself like a king in exile. But when 2nd Lieutenant Charles de Gaulle was assigned to the 33rd Infantry Regiment in Arras, he had the fortune to serve under a colonel who would profoundly shape his early career. That colonel's name was Philippe Pétain. In those years before the storm, de Gaulle studied the art of war with devotion. He read military theory. He observed tactics. He learned from Pétain, who seemed to embody the values of discipline and duty that de Gaulle revered. The relationship between the two men was one of mentor and student, respect and ambition. Pétain saw potential in the young officer. De Gaulle saw a model of what a French soldier should be. Neither man knew that one day they would stand on opposite sides of history itself. In the summer of 1914, as Europe's great powers rushed toward collision, Charles de Gaulle was 23 years old. He had not yet faced enemy fire. He had not yet been tested. He was eager for the chance. He wanted to prove himself, to defend France, to be part of something larger than himself. The chance came sooner than anyone expected. On June 28, 1914, in a city called Sarajevo, an archduke was shot. Within weeks, the dominoes began to fall. Alliances activated, armies mobilized, and on August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. Charles de Gaulle was about to receive his baptism by fire. Baptism by fire. The morning of August 15, 1914, broke grey and cold. Lieutenant de Gaulle stood with his platoon near the Belgian town of Dinant, watching the fog roll across the fields. Somewhere beyond that curtain of white, the German army was advancing. The sound of distant artillery echoed like thunder that refused to end. The 33rd Regiment had been thrown immediately into the path of the German advance. General Charles Lanrezac, commanding the French Fifth Army, clung to tactics from another age. He believed in the spirit of the bayonet charge, in the courage of men advancing in formation. He believed that élan, fighting spirit, could overcome modern firepower. He was catastrophically wrong. When the order came to advance, de Gaulle led his men forward. The fields erupted. German machine guns opened fire with a sound like tearing cloth, and Frenchmen began to fall in rows. Artillery shells screamed down, turning earth and flesh into chaos. This was not the war the generals had imagined. This was industrial slaughter. De Gaulle felt the impact before he heard the shot. His knee exploded in pain. He fell, blood darkening his uniform. Medics dragged him from the field as his men continued to die around him. In a field hospital, as doctors worked to save his leg, de Gaulle learned what modern war truly meant. It meant suffering. It meant waste. It meant that courage alone could not stop a bullet, but courage could make a man return. By October, de Gaulle was back with his regiment. He had been promoted to first lieutenant. The wound had healed enough for him to walk, though he would limp for months. More importantly, his eyes had been opened. He saw how the French military establishment sent men to die for nothing, hurling them against fortified positions with outdated tactics. He saw how generals refused to adapt, how they sacrificed soldiers rather than admit their strategies had failed. De Gaulle began to think, and what he thought made him dangerous. In early 1915, he developed a unique method of gathering intelligence. While other officers ordered reconnaissance patrols, de Gaulle himself crawled into no man's land at night. He slithered through the mud, past corpses and barbed wire, close enough to German trenches to hear enemy conversations. The information he brought back was so valuable that in January 1915, he received a citation for bravery. By September, he was promoted to captain. He was 24 years old, and he had learned that war rewarded intelligence as much as courage. But war also demanded its price. On March 10th, 1915, during the First Battle of Champagne, de Gaulle was leading his company in an attack when a bullet tore through his left hand. The pain was blinding. Blood poured between his fingers. For the second time, he was dragged from the battlefield, his men's faces the last thing he saw before darkness took him. 4 months of recovery. 4 months to think, to read, to study. 4 months to watch the war grind on without him, consuming French youth like a furnace consuming wood. When de Gaulle returned to duty in July, he took command of the 10th Company of the 33rd Regiment. The unit had moved to a quieter sector along the Aisne River. The quiet did not last. On February 21st, 1916, the earth itself seemed to open. Germany launched a massive offensive against the fortified city of Verdun. The attack was meant to bleed France white, to force the French army to sacrifice so many men in Verdun's defense that France would have no choice but to surrender. General Pétain was given command of Verdun's defense, and he called for reinforcements. The 33rd Regiment answered. De Gaulle's company arrived at Verdun in early March. What they found was hell made real. The landscape had been transformed into a moonscape of craters and shattered trees. The air reeked of cordite and decay. The roar of artillery never ceased. Shells fell without warning, without mercy. Men lived in holes in the ground, if they lived at all. On March 2nd, 1916, de Gaulle received orders to lead a counterattack. His company had become surrounded in a position near the village of Douaumont. The Germans were closing in. If they did not break out, they would be captured or killed. De Gaulle gathered his men. He looked into their exhausted faces, saw their fear, and felt his own. But he could not show it. A leader could not show fear. He raised his sword and ordered the charge. They ran forward into German fire. The air around them came alive with bullets. De Gaulle felt his men falling, heard their screams. Then something struck him, a bayonet driven into his left thigh. The pain was sharp and immediate. He stumbled, tried to keep running. Then came the explosion. A shell burst close enough that the concussion threw him to the ground. Gas flooded his lungs. Poison. He could not breathe. His vision blurred. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the grey German uniforms closing around him. When he woke, he was a prisoner. The captive years. They told Pétain that Captain de Gaulle was dead. In the regimental journal, Pétain wrote an epitaph. An outstanding officer in all respects. It was March 2nd, 1916. The Battle of Verdun would rage for 10 more months. But Charles de Gaulle would not see any of it. He had survived. Barely. The bayonet wound in his thigh was deep. The poison gas had seared his lungs. When he regained consciousness in a German collection point for prisoners, surrounded by wounded and dying men, he faced a new reality. The war was over for him, or so the Germans believed. They moved him to a prison camp at Osnabrück, then Neisse, then Stettin, then Rosenberg, Passau, Magdeburg. With each transfer, the conditions worsened. The food grew scarcer. The guards grew harsher. But de Gaulle's spirit did not break. Instead, it hardened into something unbreakable. He tried to escape. The first attempt failed within hours. He tried again, failed again, a third time, a fourth. Each time, he was caught and punished. Each time, he learned. After his fifth escape attempt, the Germans decided he warranted special treatment. They transferred him to the fortress at Ingolstadt, designated as a reprisal camp for the most disobedient officers. If they thought the fortress would break him, they were wrong. At Ingolstadt, de Gaulle found something unexpected, a community of brilliant, restless minds. Among the prisoners were some of the finest intellects in the French and Russian armies. One of them was a Russian lieutenant named Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who would later become a marshal in the Red Army. Another was the French aviator Roland Garros, who taught de Gaulle about the future of air power. But captivity did more than introduce de Gaulle to influential men. It gave him time to think, time to read, time to study the war from a distance and see its patterns, its mistakes, its lessons. He read German newspapers smuggled into the camp. He followed the course of battles, analyzing tactics and strategies. He gave lectures to his fellow prisoners on military history and theory. His French comrades nicknamed him the Connétable, the Constable, because of his commanding presence and his conviction that France would eventually triumph. He also began to write, working in secret, using whatever materials he could find. De Gaulle drafted his first book, The Enemy's House Divided, an analysis of Germany's internal divisions and the factors that would lead to its defeat. He examined how Germany had failed at Verdun not because French defense was inherently superior, but because the Germans lacked the will to press their advantage. He studied the role of morale, leadership, and the relationship between military and civilian authorities. Most importantly, he began to formulate his own theories about the future of warfare. During those long months in prison, de Gaulle reached a conclusion that few others had yet grasped. Modern war would not be won by men in trenches. It would be won by mobility, by mechanization, by the intelligent use of new technologies like tanks and aircraft. War was changing, and any nation that failed to change with it would be destroyed. When he heard news of the tank battle at Cambrai in November 1917, de Gaulle became convinced. Tanks were the future. Armored divisions, supported by air power and mobile infantry, would sweep away the stagnation of trench warfare. This was not the war of the past. This was the war of tomorrow. But de Gaulle could do nothing about it from behind bars. He could only think, write, and wait for the war to end. On November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed. The Great War was over. Germany had been defeated. On December 1st, 3 weeks later, Charles de Gaulle walked out of Ingolstadt as a free man. He had spent 32 months as a prisoner. He had missed half the war. He returned to France, believing he had been cheated of his chance to serve, to prove himself, to participate in France's victory. He arrived at his father's house to find his 3 brothers all alive. They had served, they had fought, they had survived. The family was intact. France had won, but the cost had been almost unbearable. Nearly 1.4 million Frenchmen had died. The nation was exhausted, traumatized, desperate never to experience such horror again. De Gaulle understood that desperation, but he also understood something that most of his countrymen did not want to hear. The war was not over. The treaty signed at Versailles was not a permanent peace. It was a pause, a breathing space before the next round of fighting. And when that fighting came, France would need to be ready. He would spend the next 20 years trying to convince his nation of this truth. And for 20 years, almost no one would listen. The prophet ignored. In 1919, Charles de Gaulle volunteered for the French military mission to Poland. The new Polish nation was fighting for survival against Bolshevik Russia, and France had pledged support. De Gaulle went eagerly. Finally, a chance to command in actual combat, to apply the theories he had developed in prison. He served as an infantry instructor with the Polish army. He fought in operations near the rivers Bruch, distinguishing himself enough to receive Poland's highest military decoration, the Virtuti Militari. For the first time since his capture at Verdun, he led men in battle. For the first time, he tasted victory. He returned to France in 1921 with a reputation and a future. He was promoted to major. He was offered the chance to stay in Poland and build a career there. Instead, he chose France. Whatever his ambitions, his loyalty belonged to his homeland. That same year, he married Yvonne Vondru, a young woman he had met at a military ball. She was 21, he was 31. Their marriage would last 49 years and produce 3 children. Yvonne became his anchor, the quiet strength behind his public persona. While he built his career and shaped his theories, she maintained the home, raised their children, and endured his long absences with patient grace. In 1922, de Gaulle was admitted to the École Supérieure de Guerre, France's prestigious military staff college. He threw himself into his studies, but his time there revealed the fundamental conflict that would define his career. He was brilliant. His instructors acknowledged that, but he was also arrogant, argumentative, and unwilling to defer to authority when he believed authority was wrong. His final marks were lower than expected. Why? Because he had gotten into a conflict with the commandant over strategy. De Gaulle believed that future wars would require offensive mobility and mechanized forces. The commandant, like most of France's military establishment, believed that defense was paramount, that the lessons of 1914-1918 proved that offense was futile, that France's security lay in fortifications and static defense. De Gaulle refused to back down. It cost him. After the War College, he began teaching at Saint-Cyr. He also served as an aide to Marshal Pétain, who was now one of France's most powerful military figures. Their relationship was complex. Pétain respected de Gaulle's intellect but found his independence troubling. De Gaulle revered Pétain but could not suppress his own ideas. In 1927, de Gaulle was assigned to the French occupation forces in the Rhineland. There in Germany, he watched Hitler's National Socialist movement gain strength. He saw the German nation humiliated by Versailles, impoverished by economic collapse, hungry for restoration. He understood that Germany would rise again, and when it did, it would seek revenge. He returned to France with a warning: prepare for the next war. France's military strategy was dangerously outdated. The emphasis on defense was a recipe for defeat. In 1934, he published Vers l'armée de métier, the army of the future. In this book, de Gaulle laid out his vision. France needed a professional, mechanized army, not conscripts trained for static defense, but experts trained for mobile warfare. He called for the creation of 6 armored divisions, totaling 100,000 men, equipped with 3,000 tanks, and supported by air power, reconnaissance units, and motorized infantry. This force would not wait behind fortifications. It would strike. It would maneuver. It would exploit breakthroughs and destroy enemy formations before they could consolidate. The emphasis would be on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force at decisive points. It was revolutionary thinking. It was exactly the kind of thinking that could have saved France. Almost no one listened. The French military establishment rejected his ideas. They were committed to the Maginot Line, a massive system of fortifications along the German border that consumed enormous resources and embodied the philosophy of static defense. They believed that modern firepower made offensive operations impossible. They believed that France could simply wait behind its walls while any German attack exhausted itself. Politicians were even less receptive. De Gaulle's call for a professional army alarmed them. France's identity was bound up in the concept of the citizen soldier, the levée en masse, the nation in arms. A professional army seemed anti-democratic, even fascistic. Besides, the country was exhausted. The economy was struggling. The population wanted peace, not preparation for war. Only one politician gave de Gaulle serious attention: Paul Reynaud, a member of the Chamber of Deputies. Reynaud recognized the merit in de Gaulle's arguments and tried to bring them to the attention of the government. He failed. The French parliament was too divided, too weak, too frightened of provoking another conflict. De Gaulle's relationship with Pétain deteriorated. In 1938, de Gaulle published La France et son armée, France and her army, a historical study that Pétain believed should have been credited to him. The two men quarreled. The student and mentor became rivals. By 1939, de Gaulle was a colonel commanding a tank regiment. He was 50 years old. He had spent 2 decades trying to prepare France for the coming war. He had written books, given speeches, made proposals. He had warned that Germany was rearming, that Hitler's intentions were clear, that France's defensive strategy was inadequate. He had been ignored at every turn. And then, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun. De Gaulle's prophecy was coming true, but France was not ready. The hour of catastrophe. The winter of 1939-1940 became known as the Phony War. After declaring war on Germany, France and Britain did almost nothing. The French army sat behind the Maginot Line, waiting. The British Expeditionary Force deployed to France and waited. Everyone waited. De Gaulle did not wait patiently. He watched the inaction with growing frustration. Germany had committed almost its entire army to Poland. France could have struck into Western Germany with overwhelming force. Instead, the French High Command did nothing. They allowed Hitler to conquer Poland, then turn his full attention westward. The opportunity was lost. During those winter months, de Gaulle continued to push his ideas. In January 1940, he sent a memorandum to 80 French political and military leaders, warning them that the Maginot Line would fail, that Germany would attack through the Low Countries and the Ardennes Forest, that only mobile armored divisions could meet the threat. He pleaded for the creation of the mechanized force he had proposed years earlier. He might as well have been speaking to stone. On May 10, 1940, the storm broke. Germany launched its offensive into Belgium and the Netherlands. The French and British armies, responding exactly as German planners had anticipated, rushed north to meet the invasion. Then came the blow that changed everything. German panzer divisions drove through the Ardennes, which French intelligence had deemed impassable for tanks. It was the nightmare de Gaulle had foreseen. The German armored thrust cut through the weakest part of the French lines, breaking out at Sedan, the same place where France had been humiliated in 1870. Within days, German tanks were racing toward the English Channel, threatening to cut off all Allied forces in Belgium. France was being eviscerated. On May 11th, de Gaulle was given command of the 4th Armored Division. The unit was newly formed, inexperienced, and under strength. He was told to counterattack the German spearhead, General Alphonse Georges, commanding the northeastern front, told him, "Here is your chance to act." De Gaulle knew it was hopeless, but he also knew he had to try. He gathered what forces he could and launched his attack on May 17th near Montcornet. For a few hours, his division pushed forward, actually penetrating German lines and destroying tanks and supply vehicles. Then German aircraft appeared. Stuka dive bombers screamed down, tearing his formations apart. Without air support, without sufficient infantry, without the depth of resources needed for sustained operations, de Gaulle was forced to withdraw. 2 days later, he attacked again at Crécy. Again, he achieved initial success. Again, German air power and reinforcements drove him back, but de Gaulle had accomplished something remarkable. In the midst of France's collapse, while other units were surrendering or fleeing, he had actually fought. He had proven that armored divisions, properly used, could strike back. His efforts earned him promotion to temporary brigadier general on May 25th. At 49, he had achieved the rank he would hold for the rest of his life. It was too little, too late. On June 6th, as German forces closed in on Paris, Prime Minister Paul Reynaud appointed de Gaulle to his cabinet as Under-Secretary of State for National Defense and War. De Gaulle's primary task was to coordinate with Britain and explore whether France could continue fighting. He flew to London multiple times to meet with Winston Churchill. The two men developed a mutual respect, though they would clash many times in the years ahead. De Gaulle saw in Churchill a leader who understood that surrender was not an option. Churchill saw in de Gaulle a French officer who refused to accept defeat. But in Paris, defeatism was spreading like disease. The French government was disintegrating. Millions of civilians were fleeing south, clogging roads, abandoning homes. The army was shattered. German tanks were approaching the capital. On June 10th, the government fled to Bordeaux. On June 14th, Paris fell without a fight. German soldiers marched down the Champs-Élysées, and the swastika flew over the Arc de Triomphe. In Bordeaux, the French cabinet met in chaos. Reynaud wanted to fight on, perhaps from North Africa. Others demanded an immediate armistice. The debate grew heated. De Gaulle argued passionately for resistance. France still had an empire, he insisted. It still had the French fleet. Britain remained in the fight. The United States might yet join the war, but the defeatists had the majority. On June 16th, Reynaud resigned. President Albert Lebrun appointed Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun, now 84 years old, as the new prime minister. Pétain's first act was to request an armistice from Germany. De Gaulle was in Bordeaux when he heard the news. His mentor, the man he had once revered, was surrendering France without firing another shot. Pétain believed France had lost, that further resistance was pointless, that the nation must accept defeat and make the best terms possible. De Gaulle believed the opposite. France had lost a battle, but the war was not over. This was a world war. The fight would continue, and if the French government would not continue it, then someone else must. On the evening of June 16th, de Gaulle received a phone call. Winston Churchill was offering him a place on a British aircraft, leaving for London the next morning. De Gaulle understood what this meant. If he boarded that plane, he would be breaking with his government. He would be disobeying orders. He would be committing what many would call treason. He thought of his wife and children, still in France. He thought of his country, about to surrender. He thought of the oath he had taken as a soldier, the duty he owed to France. And he made his choice. On the morning of June 17, 1940, Charles de Gaulle boarded a British aircraft and left France. He carried nothing but his uniform and his unshakable conviction that France must fight on. He was about to become the most controversial figure in French history. The voice from London. The plane landed in London on the afternoon of June 17th. De Gaulle had spent the flight in silence, staring at the clouds, wrestling with the magnitude of what he was about to do. He had no army, he had no government, he had no authority to speak for France. He was a junior general, his rank not even permanent, who had disobeyed his superiors and fled his country in its darkest hour. What he had was a belief, a single, blazing belief that would not be extinguished. When he met with Churchill that evening, de Gaulle made a request. He wanted to address the French people by radio. He wanted to tell them that the war was not over, that France's honor demanded resistance, that they must not accept Pétain's surrender. Churchill understood the political danger. The British government was trying to maintain relations with Pétain's regime. The British cabinet was skeptical. Some members argued that allowing an unknown French general to broadcast revolutionary rhetoric could damage Anglo-French relations. Why support a rebellious subordinate against France's legitimate government? But Churchill overruled them. He recognized something in de Gaulle, a quality of moral courage that transcended rank or authority. On June 18th, he gave his permission. That evening at 10 o'clock, de Gaulle stood before a microphone in a BBC studio. The room was small, utilitarian. There was no audience, no fanfare, just a French general, an announcer, and a machine that would carry his voice across the English Channel to his conquered homeland. De Gaulle had written his speech that afternoon. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered. This was the moment. This was the point of no return. The announcer introduced him, General de Gaulle of the French army. De Gaulle began to speak. His voice was deep, resonant, firm. He spoke with the authority of a man who believed absolutely in what he was saying. The leaders who, for many years, have been at the head of the French armies have formed a government. Alleging the defeat of our armies, this government has made contact with the enemy to stop the fighting. It is true, we have been, and still are, overwhelmed by the mechanical, ground, and air forces of the enemy. But has the last word been said? Must hope disappear? Is defeat final? No. He paused, letting that single word hang in the air. No, against all evidence, against all despair, against the testimony of events. No, for France is not alone. She is not alone. She has a vast empire behind her. She can align herself with the British Empire that holds the seas and continues the fight. She can, like England, make unlimited use of the immense industrial resources of the United States. His voice grew stronger, more insistent. The same means that have defeated us can one day bring victory. For France is not alone. She is not alone. She is not alone. And then came the words that would define his entire life. Whatever happens, the flame of French resistance must not be extinguished and will not be extinguished. He called on French soldiers, engineers, and armament workers in Britain to contact him. He declared that this was a world war and that the Battle of France was only one part of it. He predicted that the same mechanical forces that had destroyed France would one day destroy Germany. The broadcast lasted 4 minutes. Almost no one heard it. The BBC had not advertised the speech. Few French citizens had access to British radio. Those who did were scattered refugees or people in unoccupied territories who happened to be listening. Of the approximately 10,000 French soldiers and civilians in Britain at the time, only about 300 responded to de Gaulle's call. The French government condemned him immediately. On July 4th, a military court in Toulouse sentenced him in absentia to 4 years in prison. On August 2nd, a second court-martial condemned him to death for treason. But de Gaulle had crossed the Rubicon. There was no going back. On June 22nd, 4 days after his first broadcast, he was allowed to speak again. This time, the BBC recorded it. This time, more people listened. De Gaulle repeated his arguments, expanded on them, made his position even clearer. The armistice was not just a surrender, it was slavery. France would lose its armies, its weapons, its territory. The nation would be occupied, subjugated, destroyed. I say honor, for France has undertaken not to lay down arms save in agreement with her allies. I say common sense, for it is absurd to consider the struggle as lost. I say the higher interests of the country, for this war is a world war. He ended with a declaration that echoed across the years. I, General de Gaulle, currently in London, invite all French soldiers, sailors, and airmen to join me. I invite all French engineers and skilled armaments workers to join me. Long live Free France, in honor and independence. Free France. That was the name he gave to his movement. It was audacious. It was presumptuous. He had no right to call himself France. He was one man with a microphone and a dream. But the dream began to grow. Slowly, painfully slowly, volunteers arrived. French sailors escaped from Britain and joined him. Soldiers who refused repatriation made their way to London. Colonial territories in Africa, one by one, declared for Free France rather than Vichy. De Gaulle began to build an organization, a shadow government, an army in exile. Churchill recognized him as the leader of Free France. It was a political calculation. Britain needed France to continue fighting, even if that France was only a symbol. But it was also genuine respect. Churchill saw in de Gaulle a man of indomitable will, even if that will made him difficult to work with. The Americans were less impressed. President Franklin Roosevelt distrusted de Gaulle from the start. He thought de Gaulle was arrogant, power-hungry, a would-be dictator. Roosevelt wanted to work with other French generals, with anyone but de Gaulle. For years, the United States would refuse to fully recognize Free France. De Gaulle did not care. He knew that he had no power except moral authority, and he guarded that authority jealously. He insisted at all times that he spoke for France, not for a faction, not for a party, but for France itself. He could never appear weak, never compromise, never defer. The moment he seemed to be just another exile, just another general taking orders from foreign powers, his legitimacy would evaporate. So he fought everyone. He fought the British when they tried to control Free French forces. He fought the Americans when they tried to sideline him. He fought other French generals who claimed authority. He fought with an intensity that exhausted everyone around him, but he never stopped fighting. In the summer of 1940, as Britain faced the threat of German invasion, as the Luftwaffe bombed London night after night, Charles de Gaulle worked from a small office to keep the idea of France alive. He broadcast on the BBC, rallying resistance fighters inside occupied France. He organized Free French forces, training them for the battles ahead. He made contact with resistance networks, coordinating their efforts. Most importantly, he refused to let the world forget that France had not truly surrendered. Marshal Pétain might have signed an armistice. The Vichy government might collaborate with Germany, but Free France remained at war. The flames still burned. Years in the wilderness. For the next 4 years, Charles de Gaulle lived in a kind of political purgatory. He led an army that did not yet exist and represented a government that had no territory. He worked from London, then later from Africa, constantly maneuvering to maintain his position against rivals, allies, and enemies. It was a lonely struggle. Free French forces participated in several operations during 1940 and 1941, mostly with mixed results. An attempted landing at Dakar in September 1940, meant to rally French West Africa, ended in humiliating failure. Operations in Syria and Lebanon against Vichy forces succeeded but left bitter divisions. Every action de Gaulle took was scrutinized, criticized, and often undermined by the British and Americans who provided his resources. Roosevelt, in particular, seemed determined to replace him. In 1942, when Allied forces invaded North Africa in Operation Torch, the Americans chose to work with General Henri Giraud, a respected French officer who had escaped from German captivity. Roosevelt believed Giraud would be more cooperative, more reasonable than the prickly de Gaulle. De Gaulle fought back through sheer force of will. He maneuvered, negotiated, and outplayed Giraud politically. By mid-1943, he had secured sole leadership of the French Committee of National Liberation in Algiers. Giraud, despite American backing, was forced to resign. Meanwhile, inside France, the resistance was growing. De Gaulle had sent Jean Moulin, one of his most trusted agents, to unify the scattered resistance networks under Free French leadership. In May 1943, Moulin succeeded in creating the National Council of the Resistance, bringing together 8 major groups under a single organization loyal to de Gaulle. It was a triumph, but it came at a terrible cost. In June 1943, the Gestapo captured Moulin. They tortured him brutally. He died without revealing any secrets. His death was a devastating blow to de Gaulle personally and to the resistance. But the movement continued. By 1944, the French resistance had become a significant force inside occupied France, sabotaging German operations, gathering intelligence, and preparing for the day when Allied armies would return. That day was approaching. In early 1944, plans for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of France, were being finalized. De Gaulle was not informed of the details. Eisenhower and Churchill knew that telling de Gaulle anything was risky. He might protest, make demands, create complications. They preferred to keep him in the dark. On June 2, 1944, de Gaulle was suddenly summoned to London. There, Churchill and Eisenhower finally told him the invasion would begin in days. Free French forces would participate, and if things went well, Paris would be liberated by French troops. De Gaulle had insisted on this point for years. French soil must be liberated by French soldiers. It was essential for France's honor, for the nation's ability to hold its head high after the war. Eisenhower, to his credit, agreed. He ordered that the French 2nd Armored Division under General Philippe Leclerc would be the first to enter Paris. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. De Gaulle was not there. He listened to the news from London, waiting, praying that the invasion would succeed. It did. Over the following weeks, Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began driving across France. German forces, facing attacks from multiple directions and constant sabotage from the resistance, began a fighting withdrawal. Paris, occupied for 4 years, started to stir with hope. On August 14, 1944, the Paris police went on strike. By August 19, the resistance in Paris had launched a full uprising. Barricades appeared in the streets. Resistance fighters seized the prefecture of police. The Germans, following Hitler's orders, prepared to destroy the city rather than let it be liberated intact. De Gaulle, now in France, sent urgent messages to Eisenhower. Paris must be taken immediately. If the Allies delayed, the Germans would raise the city. If the communists within the resistance seized control before Free French forces arrived, France might descend into civil war. Eisenhower had planned to bypass Paris, to avoid costly urban combat and keep his forces driving toward Germany. But de Gaulle's arguments convinced him. He ordered General Leclerc to advance on Paris. On August 25, 1944, Leclerc's tanks trucks rolled into the city. Parisians poured into the streets, weeping, cheering, embracing the soldiers. The Germans surrendered. Paris was free. That afternoon, Charles de Gaulle entered the city in triumph. The return. The scene was beyond description. The Champs-Élysées was filled with more people than anyone had ever seen gathered in one place. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps a million, lining both sides of the broad avenue. Buildings draped with tricolor flags. Windows thrown open. Faces everywhere, screaming, crying, singing. De Gaulle stood tall in an open vehicle, slowly making his way toward the Arc de Triomphe. He wore his uniform of a brigadier general. His face was grave, almost stern. He did not wave or smile. He simply stood, towering over the crowd, embodying France itself. Bullets suddenly cracked through the air. German snipers were still in the city, still fighting. The crowd panicked, ducking, running. De Gaulle did not flinch. He continued walking, his pace unchanged. If there were snipers, so be it. He would not show fear. He could not. He reached Notre Dame Cathedral for a Te Deum ceremony. More shots rang out inside the cathedral. People dove for cover behind pillars and pews. De Gaulle walked calmly to the front and took his seat. Later, when someone asked him about his courage under fire, he dismissed it. He had not been thinking about bullets. He had been thinking about what this moment meant. After 4 years of exile, after countless humiliations and struggles, after being written off as a traitor and a fool, he had returned. France had returned. He spoke to the crowd from the Hôtel de Ville. Paris, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated, liberated by itself, liberated by its people with the help of the French armies, with the support and the help of all France. It was classic de Gaulle. He acknowledged the Allies' contribution with the support and help of all France, but he emphasized French action. Paris had liberated itself. France was not a victim rescued by others. France was a nation that had fought for its freedom. It was historical myth-making, and de Gaulle knew it. American and British forces had done the heavy lifting. Without the D-Day invasion, without years of Allied support for free France, liberation would have been impossible. But de Gaulle understood something that his critics often missed. Myths matter. National pride matters. If France was to recover from the trauma of defeat and occupation, the French people needed to believe they had participated in their own liberation, so he gave them that belief. In September 1944, de Gaulle became head of the provisional government of the French Republic. He began the immense task of reconstructing France. The country was in ruins, the economy was destroyed, the currency was worthless, infrastructure was shattered. Politically, France was deeply divided between collaborators and resistors, between communists and conservatives, between those who had stayed and those who had fled. De Gaulle moved ruthlessly to consolidate control. Suspected collaborators were arrested. Some were executed after hasty trials. Others were shaved, humiliated, and imprisoned. The purge was brutal and often unjust, but de Gaulle believed France needed to purge itself of the stain of collaboration before it could move forward. He also faced a fundamental question. What kind of government would France have? The Third Republic had been destroyed. The Fourth Republic had not yet been created. De Gaulle wanted a strong presidency, a constitution that would prevent the parliamentary chaos that had paralyzed France before the war. But the political parties wanted the opposite. The communists, the socialists, the Christian Democrats, all feared a strong executive. They associated presidential power with dictatorship, with Pétain, with Napoleon III. They wanted parliamentary sovereignty, with the president as a figurehead. De Gaulle fought them. He tried to convince the nation that France needed decisive leadership, but the parties were too strong, too entrenched. In January 1946, realizing he could not get the constitution he wanted, de Gaulle resigned. He expected the country to call him back. Surely France would see that it needed him. Surely, without his leadership, the Fourth Republic would collapse into the same chaos that had destroyed the Third. He was half right. The Fourth Republic did become chaotic and unstable. Governments formed and fell with bewildering speed. France struggled with colonial wars in Indochina and Algeria. The economy grew, but political life was paralyzed. But France did not call him back, not for 12 years. The Desert Crossing. From 1946 to 1958, Charles de Gaulle crossed his own political desert. He lived in self-imposed exile at his home in Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, a small village in northeastern France. There, in a modest house, he spent his days writing his memoirs and watching France from a distance. He wrote with discipline and elegance. His war memoirs became a classic of French literature, combining historical narrative with philosophical reflection. The volumes, The Call to Honor, Unity, and Salvation, traced his journey from the catastrophe of 1940 to the liberation of 1944. They were not merely a personal account, they were an explanation of his vision for France, a justification of his actions, and a warning about the dangers of weak leadership. The books sold widely. They reminded the French people that de Gaulle existed, that he was still thinking about France's future. But he had no political power. In 1947, he founded a new political movement, the Rally of the French People. He hoped it would grow into a mass movement that could pressure the Fourth Republic to reform. For a few years, it seemed to work. The rally won seats in parliament and drew large crowds to de Gaulle's speeches. But it never achieved a governing majority. The other parties united to keep Gaullists out of power. By 1953, de Gaulle recognized that his movement had failed. He dissolved it and retreated once again to Colombey. He was 63 years old. Many assumed his career was over. He had been France's savior during the war, but the nation had moved on. The Fourth Republic was flawed but functional. France was recovering economically. Life was returning to normal. And then Algeria exploded. Algeria was not simply a colony. According to French law, it was part of France itself, divided into départements like Provence or Brittany. More than 1 million French settlers, the Pieds Noirs, lived there alongside 9 million Muslims. The settlers dominated the economy and politics. The Muslim majority had few rights and no voice. In 1954, the Algerian National Liberation Front, FLN, launched an armed rebellion. They wanted independence. The French government refused to consider it. Algeria was France. Losing Algeria would mean losing a part of the nation itself. The war grew increasingly brutal. Both sides committed atrocities. The FLN used terrorism. The French military used torture. Soldiers died, civilians died. The fighting consumed resources, divided French society, and destroyed one government after another. By 1958, France was approaching collapse. The military in Algeria, furious that politicians seemed willing to negotiate with the FLN, staged a revolt. On May 13th, officers and settlers seized control of Algiers. They formed a committee of public safety and demanded that Charles de Gaulle be brought to power. It was a dangerous moment. France stood on the edge of civil war. If the military in Algeria decided to march on Paris, who would stop them? The Fourth Republic had no authority, no strength, no credibility. On June 1st, 1958, President René Coty asked de Gaulle to form a government. The National Assembly, with no other option, granted him emergency powers for 6 months. His task: write a new constitution and solve the Algerian crisis. At age 67, Charles de Gaulle returned to power. Architect of a new republic, de Gaulle's first trip as prime minister was to Algiers. On June 4, 1958, he stood before a massive crowd of French settlers and soldiers. They cheered him. They believed he would keep Algeria French. They believed he understood them. De Gaulle raised his arms and spoke the 3 words that would haunt him for years. Je vous ai compris. I have understood you. No one knew what he meant. Did he support French Algeria? Did he support the settlers? Did he promise to keep Algeria part of France? Or was he simply acknowledging their passion without committing to their cause? De Gaulle never clarified. He spoke in ambiguities because he had not yet decided what to do. He knew Algeria could not remain French, not in the old way. The world was changing. Colonialism was dying. But he also knew that France could not simply abandon the settlers or accept a humiliating defeat. He needed time, and he needed power to act without parliamentary interference. Over the summer of 1958, de Gaulle and his team drafted a new constitution. The Fifth Republic would be fundamentally different from its predecessors. The president would no longer be a figurehead. He would have real power, the ability to dissolve parliament, to rule by decree in emergencies, to conduct foreign policy, to command the military. The parliament would still exist, elections would still matter, but the president would be the ultimate authority, especially in times of crisis. On September 28, 1958, the French people voted on the new constitution. Nearly 80% approved it. On December 21st, an electoral college elected de Gaulle as the first president of the Fifth Republic. He took office in January 1959. He was now the most powerful French leader since Napoleon, and he used that power to do what no one expected. He ended the Algerian War. It took 4 years. 4 years of careful maneuvering, of speeches that hinted at his intentions without stating them directly, of gradually shifting public opinion. In 1959, he offered Algeria self-determination, the right to choose its own future. The settlers were horrified. They felt betrayed. In January 1960, they revolted. In April 1961, 4 generals in Algiers attempted a coup, trying to overthrow de Gaulle's government and keep Algeria French by force. De Gaulle went on television and appealed directly to French soldiers, ordering them not to follow the rebellious generals. They obeyed. The coup collapsed. The generals were arrested. De Gaulle also survived multiple assassination attempts by the organization Armée Secrète, OAS, a terrorist group formed by desperate settlers. In August 1962, the OAS ambushed de Gaulle's car at Petit Clamart. Machine gun bullets shattered the windows. De Gaulle and his wife, sitting in the back seat, remained calm as their driver accelerated away. They escaped without injury. When someone later asked de Gaulle about the attack, he simply said, "They shoot like pigs." On March 18, 1962, after 2 years of negotiations, de Gaulle signed the Évian Accords with the FLN. The agreement granted Algeria independence. In April, a referendum asked the French people to approve. Nearly 91% voted yes. On July 3, 1962, Algeria became an independent nation. France had lost its most valuable colonial possession, but de Gaulle had saved France from a far worse fate: civil war, military dictatorship, and moral degradation. The decision was painful, but it was necessary, and it freed him to pursue his true ambition, restoring France to greatness. The politics of grandeur. With Algeria settled, de Gaulle turned his attention to foreign policy. He had a vision, and it was audacious. France would be independent, powerful, and respected. France would not be a junior partner to the United States or Britain. France would not bow to American or Soviet power. France would chart its own course. He called this vision grandeur. His first step was nuclear weapons. If France was to be a major power, it needed its own nuclear deterrent. It could not rely on American protection. On February 13, 1960, France successfully tested its first atomic bomb in the Sahara Desert. France became the world's fourth nuclear power. The Americans were furious. They believed nuclear weapons should be controlled by NATO, effectively meaning controlled by the United States. De Gaulle disagreed. In 1966, he withdrew France from NATO's integrated military command, though France remained a member of the alliance. French forces would no longer take orders from American generals. He also blocked Britain's application to join the European Economic Community twice. He vetoed British entry in 1963 and again in 1967. Why? Because he saw Britain as America's Trojan horse, a nation that would always prioritize its special relationship with Washington over European interests. De Gaulle wanted Europe to be independent of American influence. He envisioned a Europe of nations led by France and Germany, united in purpose but sovereign in authority. To that end, he worked tirelessly to build Franco-German cooperation. He visited Germany repeatedly, the first French head of state to do so since Napoleon. He signed the Élysée Treaty with Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, establishing close ties between the two former enemies. It was revolutionary. France and Germany, which had fought 3 wars in 70 years, were becoming partners. But de Gaulle's foreign policy alienated the United States. President Kennedy found him difficult. President Johnson found him infuriating. When de Gaulle criticized American intervention in Vietnam, when he recognized communist China, when he challenged the Bretton Woods monetary system, American leaders felt betrayed. De Gaulle did not care. France's interests, he believed, were not identical to America's. France had its own destiny. At home, de Gaulle presided over an economic boom. The 1960s saw unprecedented growth. New industries developed. Infrastructure improved. The French standard of living rose dramatically. It was called the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, and de Gaulle's policies contributed to it. But not everyone was happy. Students, workers, and intellectuals began to chafe under de Gaulle's authoritarian style. He ruled from above, making decisions without consultation. He dominated television, controlling the narrative. He seemed out of touch with younger generations who had not lived through the war and did not share his obsession with national grandeur. In May 1968, the discontent exploded. Student protests at Paris universities sparked a nationwide movement. Workers joined the students. Strikes paralyzed France. 10 million people stopped working. Protesters demanded reforms: educational reform, worker rights, more democracy, less authoritarianism. For a few weeks, it seemed de Gaulle's government might fall. The protests grew violent. Barricades appeared in Paris. The country teetered on the edge of chaos. De Gaulle disappeared briefly, flying to Germany to meet with French military commanders and ensure the army's loyalty. Then he returned and addressed the nation on television. He dissolved the National Assembly and called for new elections. He appealed for order, warning that France faced the threat of communist dictatorship. The silent majority responded. In the June 1968 elections, Gaullist parties won the largest victory in French parliamentary history. The protests faded. Order was restored. But something had changed. De Gaulle had won the battle, but he had lost his mystique. The events of May 1968 showed that he was no longer indispensable. France could imagine a future without him. In April 1969, de Gaulle proposed a referendum on regional reform and Senate reorganization. He made it clear that if the referendum failed, he would resign. On April 27, 1969, the French people voted no. 53% rejected his proposals. On April 28, 1969, Charles de Gaulle resigned as President of France. He was 70 28 years old, his career was over. The final chapter. De Gaulle returned to his home in Colombey-les-Deux-Églises. He had bought the property decades earlier, a simple house with a large garden surrounded by forests. It was where he had written his memoirs during his first exile. It was where he would spend his final days. He devoted himself to writing again. He wanted to complete his presidential memoirs, to explain the Fifth Republic and his vision for France. The first volume, Memoirs of Hope, was published, but the second volume remained unfinished. De Gaulle lived simply. He walked in his garden. He read. He avoided public appearances. When journalists asked for interviews, he refused. When politicians sought his advice, he remained silent. He had resigned, and he would not interfere with his successors. His successor was Georges Pompidou, who had served as de Gaulle's prime minister. Pompidou continued many of de Gaulle's policies, but with a lighter touch, less grandeur and more pragmatism. De Gaulle seemed at peace. He had saved France twice, once from Germany, once from civil war. He had restored French pride and independence. He had built a constitutional framework that had already proven more stable than anything France had known before. His work was done. On the evening of November 9th, 1970, de Gaulle and his wife were at home, watching the evening news. He suddenly said, "I feel a pain here," pointing to his neck. Then he collapsed. An aneurysm had ruptured. He died within seconds, 2 weeks before his 80th birthday. He had been in perfect health until that moment. It was as if his heart simply decided it had beaten long enough. His wife found him on the floor. She called for help, but it was too late. Charles de Gaulle was dead. President Pompidou announced the news to the nation on television. General de Gaulle is dead. France is a widow. The country mourned. Leaders from around the world sent condolences. Flags flew at half-mast. The loss felt personal to millions of French people, even those who had opposed him. But de Gaulle had left specific instructions for his funeral. He wanted no state funeral, no grand ceremony. He wanted to be buried in the village cemetery in Colombey, beside his daughter Anne, who had died years earlier. Only his family, his fellow veterans of the Free French, and the people of his village should attend. On November 12, 1970, they buried him in a simple grave. There were no speeches, no eulogies, just silence and grief. But in Paris on the same day, a memorial service was held at Notre Dame. Heads of state attended. Thousands gathered. The world paid tribute to a man who had shaped history through sheer force of will. The flame burns on Charles de Gaulle was not a perfect man. He was arrogant, stubborn, often difficult. He made decisions that hurt people. He pursued policies that divided France. His vision of grandeur sometimes seemed like vanity. But he was also a man who understood what it meant to refuse surrender, to refuse humiliation, to refuse to accept that might makes right, or that defeat is final. In June 1940, when France fell, when millions accepted that the war was over, when even great men like Pétain chose collaboration over resistance, de Gaulle chose differently. He had no army, no government, no real authority. He had only his conviction that France must fight on. And from that single conviction, he built everything else. He built free France from nothing. He kept the idea of resistance alive when it seemed hopeless. He fought through 4 years of exile, political battles, military setbacks, and personal humiliations. And when Paris was liberated, he walked through its streets as the embodiment of the nation's refusal to die. After the war, he built the Fifth Republic, a constitutional framework that has lasted longer than any French republic before it. He restored French pride and independence at a time when France could easily have become a permanent junior partner to the United States. He gave France a voice in world affairs, nuclear weapons, and a seat at every important table. Most importantly, he proved something that the 20th century tried to deny, that individuals matter, that one person standing alone can change the course of history, not through supernatural power or inherited authority, but through courage, intelligence, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. De Gaulle's life spanned 80 years, from the aftermath of one French defeat to the height of French recovery. He lived through 2 world wars, the collapse of empires, the rise of new ideologies. He saw France at its lowest and helped lift it back to greatness. His legacy endures. The Fifth Republic he created is still France's government. The Franco-German partnership he built is the foundation of the European Union. The concept of national independence, of refusing to bow to superpowers, remains powerful in French political culture. But perhaps his greatest legacy is simpler. He showed that resistance is possible, that when the world says, accept reality, when everyone else surrenders, when all hope seems lost, one person can stand and say no. And from that single word, from that act of refusal, everything can change. The flame he lit on June 18, 1940, still burns. These are not just stories. They are echoes of real men and women who refused to fall, who stood when others knelt, who spoke when others were silent. If this story moved you, honor that courage. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who needs to remember that surrender is always a choice and resistance is always possible. Because the next legend is already waiting to be told. And like Charles de Gaulle standing before a microphone in London, like every voice that has ever challenged the darkness, we will tell it. The flame burns on. Long live France. Long live the courage that refuses to surrender.